Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Environmentalist Politics as Utopia, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm your moderator, Erin Haygood. This event is part of Platypus's 12th annual convention. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We have chapters around the world, from Los Angeles to Leipzig, from Austin to Athens, and Chicago to Shanghai. During the current lockdown, we are hosting a number of online reading groups and panel events, such as this one. Starting next week, we are hosting 3 Introduction to Platypus virtual reading groups via Zoom, as well as our regular primary Marxist syllabus in different locations. To find out more about how to join an online reading group, go to platypus1917.org/virtual. As part of this weekend's virtual convention, we are also hosting panels tomorrow on the American Revolution and Saturday on Bonapartism, How is the State Revolutionary, and Socialism in the 21st Century. They will all be live on Zoom. Timings and Zoom links can be found at platypus1917.org/Platypus International Convention. That link's a bit difficult, but I'll put it in the chat and you can just click on it. All the links will be posted in the chat and in the Facebook event. We hope that you will join us. We also publish a monthly open submission journal, the Platypus Review. The latest issue, number 125, is very timely for our discussion today because it focuses on environmentalism in the left. It features interviews with Jonathan Zertson and Derek Jensen, as well as a response by Brian Tokar, and an interview also with a Extinction Rebellion activist from the UK. If you would like to submit an article to the Platypus Review, please send an email to editor@platypus1917.org. We would love to hear from you. You can also check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, for your dose of the commentary on the left. It is published regularly on SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. For tonight's panel, each panelist will have 10 to 20 minutes for opening remarks and then 3 to 4 minutes to respond to one another. We will have plenty of time for a Q&A discussion. When we go to the panelists' responses to each other, I will ask you to begin submitting your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. When you do so, please use your name. I will read them out for the panelists to respond. Unfortunately, due to the environment, I think we won't be able to have exactly the type of discussion that we would be able to have if we were all sitting live in a room together. So if anybody would like to kind of have a more extended response to anything the panelists say tonight, please feel free to submit a short article to the Platypus Review. I think that would be a great forum for continuing discussion after the panel. So without further ado, this is Environmentalist Politics as Utopia. We have asked the panelists to respond to the following description. With climate protesters echoing the anti-globalization Battle of Seattle and democratic socialists calling for a new New Deal, the environment is now widely cited on the left as the central pressure point for imagining the radical transformation of society. With which actors, toward what sort of society, and on the basis of what sort of historical problem is the environment to serve as the object of leftist politics? How should we understand the current politicization of the environment in relation to previous moments of environmentalist politics on the left? What sort of utopia informs the politics of environmentalism in the 21st century? And we have 4 panelists with us. I will introduce them in the order they will be speaking. First is Christian Parenti. He is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College. His most recent book is Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence. His forthcoming book is Radical Hamilton, Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder. Next, we will hear from Kaila Cook, who is an organizer with the Sunrise Movement in Chicago. Then Max Wilbert will speak. He is a 3rd-generation dissident who grew up in Seattle's post WTO anti-globalization and undoing racism movement. He has been an organizer for more than 15 years. Max is a longtime member of Deep Green Resistance and serves on the board of a small grassroots nonprofit. He holds a bachelor's degree in environmental communication, and he has several books, or perhaps he has one forthcoming and one that was released, and they're on topics of feminism and environmentalism. Finally, Earl Silbar will speak, and he is a veteran of the New Left and co-editor of the recently published You Say You Want a Revolution, SDS, Progressive Labor, and Adventures in Building a Worker-Student Alliance. So those are our panelists, and with that, I'm going to let Christian start. And Christian, I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left, and then when you have 2 minutes left, and I'll try and put it up in my screen so you can see it. If not, I will say so verbally, but hopefully I won't have to do that.
All right, and you said how long should I take to respond to these questions?
About 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay, I won't go beyond that. So first of all, thank you very much for putting this on. These kinds of things are always, very labor intensive, and I can only imagine all the more so under these weird conditions of quarantine and with all the technology involved. So in terms of like the first question, which actors towards what sort of society on the basis of what sort of historical problems is the environment to serve as the object of left politics? And I would say hopefully towards some sort of socialism, and a socialism that is sustainable. And I think that this is an important distinction. There's sometimes on the left a tendency to just assume that a socialist economy would be sustainable. And that's not necessarily the case. Marx himself identified sustainability, as it were, as something distinct, that even after capitalist social relations were overthrown and replaced by forms of collective ownership and management, there would still be this problem of how do you plan for sustainability? And that's certainly the case, all the more so the case in this moment when any kind of socialist project would inherit this toxic infrastructure, this fossil fuel economy. So, I'm not one of those people who dismisses the efforts of the new left, the pink wave in Latin America, the sort of social democratic left that in many cases emerged directly out of the defeated armed struggles. The way that Bolivia and Venezuela are hostage to these fossil fuel infrastructures that they have inherited. And you can see that real progress can be made in terms of class justice, redistribution of wealth, and diminishing poverty and empowering workers. And at the same time, no progress can be made on the question of sustainability. And it's easy to just dismiss and say, well, those guys aren't real socialists, and when the eco-socialism comes, all these contradictions will be resolved. And so, I don't think that's really fair. That I think it's kind of harder than it looks to do the sort of thing that Evo Morales and others were trying to do in Bolivia before the coup. And so, obviously, a socialism that is sustainable and not just redistributive and transformative in terms of class relations. And what the object broadly defined is twofold, right? It's the continuation of life on Earth, given the scale of the many environmental problems, not just climate change. And it's also the same old question of social justice. Even if left politics in this day and age turns out to be nothing but a kind of hospice movement for civilization, still, why should the rich get everything, right? Fidel Castro made this point actually in an obscure book, some conversation with intellectuals. He asked about the environmental crisis, and he said, look, if you were told that civilization only had 10 years left to exist, would you stop struggling? And of course not, right? Like, why should things be so brutally unfair for so many, and why should this global 1% have so much money and mismanage so many aspects of economic life? So that's the direction I would, think that the environmental movement, this moment has to go towards. And so, how should we understand the current politicization of the environment in relation to previous movements of environmental politics on the left? Well, one thing is, you know, the environmental question is no longer the property of the environmentalists and the environmental movement. And while there have been many very progressive and radical and tenacious environmentalists, there's also a really problematic legacy, particularly in American environmentalism, rooted in, you know, progressive era conservationism and its cozy relationship with other sort of, you know, racist and repressive agendas that are kind of, you know, embodied in the enclosures that were also conservation moments, creating national parks by kicking out Native Americans and kicking out, you know, squatters who were inhabiting these places as working landscapes. And environmentalism has wrestled with this. And I think in this moment of the the COVID-19 crisis, we really see that the whole nature society distinction has been obliterated, that very obviously society's relationship with nature isn't just something, some sort of obscure issue for elites who like trees and hiking, that this is absolutely vital to everyone, and in fact, most vital to poor people living in cities. So I think that the environmental problem has been, by dint of circumstances, taken away from the sort of traditional guardians of this politics. And that very crucially at the heart of that is this obliterating this nature society distinction. And that after this moment, it is going to be harder for people to conceive of quote unquote nature as this other thing outside, separate from society, that society is feeding on, and that human beings are not part of it. You know, we're all part of this. And we are, as a species, an environment-making species, like all species are. What we call nature is in fact really just the sum total of organism-environment interactions. Every organism is part of every other organism's environment, and every organism interacts with its environment and changes it. Beavers create beaver dams. Bees need flowers, but they also pollinate and reproduce these plants as they go around feeding on them. And so too do human beings create environments, and we always have. We've done that for a very, you know, it's only been really in like the last generation that we realize how important burning has been all around the planet. These insights came out of environmental history of the Northeast of the United States at first. And now we realize the really important role of anthropogenic burning in creating whole landscapes. So we're an environment making species. We always have been, and we have to become conscious of that and become conscious and sustainable environment makers, or we're going to wipe ourselves out. And in terms of some of the implications of this moment, I mean, I think, you know, along with blowing apart the nature society distinction, we see some weirdly positive, along with some obviously very negative things happening right now. One is that all sorts of, there's been a kind of impromptu, almost unconscious assault on the prerogatives of capital, right? Putting the economy into hibernation. This is like, let us listen to Lloyd Blankfein. Imagine for a moment being a billionaire in the 1%, and how horrible and unfair this moment would seem to you. I mean, you realize like every day there's built-in morbidity all over the planet, and no one shut down the global economy at which you sit at the apex. And then suddenly you've got these loyal servants like Andrew Cuomo shutting down the economy, wiping, you know, inadvertently wiping a third of the value off the market, et cetera, et cetera. So there's space to move against the prerogatives of capital. The centrality of the state has been, you know, reestablished without it even really being discussed. But what role will the state play is also obviously on the table. And we can see that there's really very dangerous, very repressive forms of power unfolding, and these have to be resisted. I couldn't see what the sign was, but I saw that it was, I'm obviously getting down there to the end of my time. So last thing I would say is that sort of what sort of utopia informs the current moment, I would say that it's, I'm not that into utopias. I would say that it is the dangerous, destabilizing utopia of laissez-faire capitalism. And in this, I'm leaning on Karl Polanyi, who saw laissez-faire, the fantasy of a society ruled by the market, as a dangerous utopia. And it was a utopia because it was impossible, that no society could be subordinated to the laws of the market without disintegrating into a howling, violent wilderness. And I mean, I think that is the utopia that is being destroyed and questioned right before our eyes.
Thanks so much, Christian. It looks like we lost Kaila for a second. So why don't we go on to Max, and hopefully she's jumping back on here. If that's okay, Max.
Yeah, that works for me. I'm not sure if, I think I'm going to be able to share my screen here because I've got a little PowerPoint. So let me set that up in just a moment.
If I had every minute back taken by PowerPoint, I would have much more of my life left to live. But.
Hopefully can y'all see my screen and my my face at the same time here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for that, Christian. That was a great analysis, and I think I agree with everything you said pretty much. So I'm going to take our prompt a little bit backwards today. I'm going to start with the problem and work towards the solution, the historical problem. And since this is a Marxist group, the Platypus Society, I'm going to start with Marx. So this is from Capital Volume 1, which was published in 1867. And Marx is talking here about what a modern scholar, John Bellamy Foster, calls the metabolic rift. And so Marx says capitalist production collects the population together in these great centers and causes the urban population to keep growing and growing. And he says all progress in capitalist agriculture is progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. So this is from 1867. So obviously the ecological problems that we're facing today aren't new. They've been with us for a long time. And I think we all know this. So we all know the numbers around the ecological crisis. I'm not really going to run through all this because I think we all know how serious this is. I think the important point to recognize is that the ecological collapse is happening now. It's not a future thing, and it's not something that is just starting right now. It's something that started quite a while ago, in fact. We're in the midst of this process. So if you are from an indigenous community, or if you have some historical knowledge from your ancestors, then maybe you remember the salmon runs in the Columbia River that filled the entire river. Maybe you remember the passenger pigeon flocks on the East Coast that darkened the entire sky. Maybe you remember the herds of buffalo or the abundance of wildlife on the Serengeti that's now a fraction of what it was. You know, wherever you go around the world, obviously, we have seen this massive decline in the natural world. So many of us here, I think all of us here are influenced by Marx. So the question to me is, can we say that just capitalism is the problem? And I don't think we can. I think the problem is deeper than capitalism. So many of you will be familiar with this. This is basically Marx's analysis of the development of human societies from primitive communism towards capitalism. And the idea of Marxism was that essentially, right, we're going to transcend capitalism and we're going to keep the best aspects of what we've learned through the process of capitalist development, and then we're going to form this new communist society eventually, right, a classless society. And I think that we need to be questioning this progress narrative in some way. I think that in some senses, Marx was obviously very brilliant, but I think he was, as we all know, I think, culturally blinkered. You know, he came from a European tradition and he had certain limitations to his knowledge and his way of looking at the world because of that. So all of these three types of society at the bottom here are types of civilization, or what we can call cultures of empire. They're societies that were characterized by imperialism, by exploitation, by high levels of hierarchy. And obviously not all human societies fall into these three categories, but these types of societies have dominated the world militarily for hundreds, thousands of years, right? And they've been incredibly destructive ecologically as well. So it doesn't matter how far you go back, you can look at the ancient Roman Empire deforesting the entirety of North Africa. You can look at the first written story of Western civilization being Gilgamesh, destroying the forests of the Middle East, what's now Iraq, to expand his power, to expand his city, to expand his empire, right? So this is a form of ecological imperialism. If you look at the bottom of this slide here, we have Homer writing in the Iliad, which was around 3,100 years ago, about the destruction caused by the exploitation of the land. So this is not a new process. So I think this is obviously deeply connected to imperialism, as Dr. Parenti has written in his book, Tropic of Chaos. You know, this system, there's a huge linkage between war, imperialism, the creation of refugees, and the destruction of the land, right? We see this linkage all the time. So I'm not really fatalistic about this situation, because those three types of society are only 5% of modern human history. And throughout the entire time that those societies have existed, there have been other people in different places on the planet living in different ways, right? Living in non-imperialistic ways, living in ways that did not destroy the land around them. So we need to have that broader perspective, right? At the same time the Romans were destroying North Africa, you have people living in the Amazon basin in a sustainable arrangement, more or less. You look at the Aborigines living in place for 40,000 years and not destroying their land, right? So this is obviously possible for humans to live in a sustainable way. And obviously this isn't to say that all these societies are paragons of virtue and they never have any sorts of problems. But there's a clear differentiation that we can make between societies that destroy the land around them and those that don't. So the society that we're living in today is not inevitable. It's the result of choices that we make, and we can make different choices, right? So the second part of the prompt is, what sort of society are we working towards? And you know, all this coronavirus crisis, the climate crisis, all the converging issues that we face right now, they're exposing the bankruptcy of globalization, the bankruptcy of extractive economics, the bankruptcy of this whole modern industrial, high energy industrial capitalism, right? We all know this way of life isn't sustainable. And it's not a mystery. What is sustainable? As I'm saying, we have thousands of examples of societies that have lived in sustainable ways over the long term, right? So I think we obviously can't go backwards. We can only go forward. And I think the future is going to look very different from the past. We're not going to unlearn many of the things that we've learned from this last, few thousand years of development, and especially the industrial development that we've seen over the past couple hundred years. But I think we need to get over the Eurocentric, culturally blinkered mythology of progress. And we need to be working for degrowth, for relocalization of our economies, of our food systems, for decolonization of our minds and of our communities and our cultures, and for new societies that are based on local ecology and fitting into the land where you live. And I think it's important to mention in this that I think feminism and the empowerment of women is a key issue here, because I don't think that we can address overpopulation without that. Thank you. So obviously, any of these one topics could be a life's work. It's hard to go into too much detail in 10 minutes, but I want to make one final point, which is that the means of production within the society are the problem in many cases. I think that's the main insight that we're seeing as we have the ecological and the environmental movements starting to increasingly influence Marxism and socialist movements. So the factories, the mining, the industrial logging, industrial fishing, industrial agriculture, these are the systems that are killing the planet. So this is in some ways where I differ from Marx's original analysis. He was living in a certain time, and based on his experience in the society he lived in, it may have seemed like industrialism can advance past the point of causing all this pollution, destroying the land, etc. I think we have 150 more years of experience now. And what we've seen during that period is the greenwashing begin in earnest, especially the last few decades. We've seen green cars being hailed as a solution when we know that cars themselves are an atrocity, right? We've seen the military adopting biofuels and solar panels. We've seen companies like Germany exporting their pollution to China and burning their forests for energy and gaining much of their revenue from creating more cars and then calling themselves green. We've seen the rise of this whole green empire mythology. It's the vision that everything can pretty much stay the same as it is now, but just be powered by green technology. That's not a solution. This is more of the same. And some people have called this climate leviathan, this prospect of a green empire. So what is to be done? At its heart, obviously, Marxism is a revolutionary method, right? I think that method needs updating for current conditions. I think we need to not only seize the means of production as Marx advocated, we need to dismantle much of the means of production. And to be specific, I mean the industrial infrastructure, those economic sectors that I talked about. These systems cannot be allowed to continue to function. I think we need a two-pronged movement. We need the above ground working to do restoration, alternative communities, local food systems, direct democracy, thanks, and mass movements to shift society in a better direction. And then I think we need a more confrontational and underground revolutionary wing working on dismantling the destructive infrastructure. And I think that may have to be, in some cases at least, by any means necessary, because we all know the ruling class won't give up their power willingly. And these industrial machines have long been the main source of their power. So this, I think it could be done mostly through nonviolent means, but we will need to ramp up strategic militant nonviolence to a much higher level than we've seen in recent years if it's going to work. What we've seen has obviously been nowhere near enough. We've seen huge expansions in fossil fuel production and consumption. So this is the strategy that I'm working toward, and the final part of that prompt was, with which actors? I think the future is going to get increasingly chaotic, increasingly dangerous, hot, dry. We need to prepare for this. We need to turn away from the industrial system. We've been taught all our lives that this industrial, modern, high energy way of life is the most important thing. That's obviously not true. It's time to build alternative systems and dismantle the infrastructure that's destroying the planet. So thank you all for coming out today. I look forward to hearing from Kaila or Earl next.
Thank you so much, Matt. Kaila, are you ready? Are you back?
I am ready. Working out some tech difficulties. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. There's a bit of static, so if
Okay.
it gets kind of hard to hear you, I'll let you know.
Yeah, maybe then I can phone in and go next if this starts a rough connection. But anyway, so I'm going to be representing the Sunrise Movement today and speak to the topic of climate justice and how that relates both to the Sunrise Movement and more broadly the Green New Deal. So Sunrise came about in the summer of 2017, for those of you who aren't familiar with our movement. And we are growing a movement of young people to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. So through Sunrise, we're essentially running our generation having a level in action on climate into a movement that's focused challenging its richest corporations and most entrenched political interests. And essentially what we believe is that climate change is bold emergence led by government, because there, quite frankly, isn't another institution in our society that can actually transform our transport systems on the timeline we need and that just demanding. So as we push our city, state, and federal government officials for this level of climate, Sunrise is justice. This requires simultaneously addressing racial and economic injustice while facing down the climate crisis. To this vision, our goal is to make the Green New Deal a reality in every corner of the country. And if this panel were in person, I would depend on how many people are Green New Deal. So I would really done talking about the details. That's no longer a possibility. So bear with me if this is an audience that's familiar with the policy. So the Green New Deal technically doesn't exist yet, which is why it's fitting at a utopia.
Kaila, we lost you. Kaila? Okay, I think
Maybe
what will happen,
give her a call.
phone number, yeah, we'll try and get her on the phone. So Nate and Clint will try and get her on the phone, and then she can start her presentation over if we can get her on the phone. Earl, are you able to talk now? Earl is muted, 1 second. Clint, can you unmute Earl?
Again.
Oh, great, Earl, I can hear you.
Can you hear me
Can you hear
now?
me? Yeah, that's great. So why don't you give your presentation and then we'll see if we can get Kaila. I think it would be better, Kaila, if you try and phone in because I think it's your internet connection just isn't good enough to get the audio to us. But Earl, I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left and then 2 minutes left. But if you'd like to speak now, great.
Okay. Well, I want to fill in some background that I think is quite important, and perhaps everybody already shares this, so please forgive me if I'm being redundant to what's already in your head. But I think the world crisis of the environment and global warming that we're seeing, I believe Christian said, we're in the middle of it. This is unfolding around us. This is not coming down the line in 30 years or 50 years. And, but behind that, or intermixed with it, is the fact that the capitalist system globally is in an economic crisis as well as an environmental and health crisis. And I'm not sure that that's visible to everybody because it appears that the economic crisis is the result of the virus and the shutdowns so that people don't spread the disease so much, and the economic dislocation. But in fact, as recently as last September and October, the Federal Reserve System poured in hundreds of billions of dollars of free money because the markets were seizing up. That is to say, big capitalists and people with big funds to invest were not buying government securities, as a reflection of the fact that there is a global shortage of investment opportunities. And that can be seen in the fact that the $1 trillion that was given to corporations and high-income individuals, also known as capitalists, in the tax reform, were not spent on investments in what they called the real economy. What do they do with that money? They bought back shares and they gave huge dividends. They didn't invest it. So all of these things that are going on look very radical, and they are very radical from the standard economic point of view of the economists. But the reality is underneath that, there is this drop in the rate of return on invested capital, so that there are not as many opportunities out there as there is money chasing. So we get balloons being blown up. So for example, the collateralized debt obligations that were all those mortgages and those subprime mortgages of 12, 13 years ago that went blown up, when they were shown to be empty and stacked with garbage and all the loans that were taken out. So now they have something called collateralized loan obligations, in which they're doing the same thing with money that was loaned to corporations that were shaky or going bankrupt. And this is a reflection of that deeper crisis in which we are caught up and which is not visible. So I wanted to introduce that because I don't think we can talk about a climate, utopian, if you will, fight to reverse or at least stop the climate disaster unfolding around us. But it's important to understand that to be successful in being able to show that capitalism is responsible for this when it's not obvious to everybody in the world by any stretch, and there's a lot of emphasis on the green capitalism, and they have put hundreds of billions into it, the reality is that if I believe it's necessary to connect the underlying crisis in the economic system along with the unfolding crisis of climate, which is visible to everybody who's got an eye to see or a nose to smell the ashes in the air. I wanted to take up this question that I believe Christian raised about sustainability and that it's not inherent, and that Max also raised. And I want to agree. I want to emphasize, I think we have to have a holistic, if you will, approach that isolates the environmental destruction in the role of capital, which only sees nature as something to exploit along with human labor power. The reality that we have to have a cultural revolution as a part of that. Cannot conceive of this as an economic class in and of itself and for itself, as if the questions of race and gender, nationality, and all the different forms of oppression have to be taken up if we are going to build a world based on those people who are convinced of the need for solidarity and the sacrifices that entails, that we cannot win that kind of participation unless we see this as an all-around assault on these different forms of oppression that maintain and sustain the capitalist system that's destroying our environment. So I would argue that this is not a new idea, but a cultural revolution, which is going on in society with the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and all these different forms, but to put them together requires a revolutionary organization which understands this task and works in a cooperative or collective way to carry it out in the different environments we find ourselves. So I think that's one thing I wanted to say. Can you tell me how much time I have left?
You have 8 minutes left.
Oh, well, that's nice because I'll finish early and somebody else can have my time. So the utopian aspect of it is can be seen in the goal of having communes everywhere where we're able to help to participate in the struggles that exist and that are coming, because I think it was Max who said things are going to get much, much worse. This is going to look relatively calm compared to what's probably coming along with this crisis, with these combination of crises. And I think it's true that it requires a revolutionary organization with this perspective and with the goal of promoting alternatives, so that as people organize and win some successes and gain a sense of our strength in organization, have a clear-cut goal that we have a picture of the world where we're going to impose that. We're going to take away the power from capital and what Marx has called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is, what should I say, have an unfortunate resonance with people who look at examples that call themselves socialist and communist and in fact didn't behave that way. But I think that's one of the things, if we're going to have a utopia to fight for, we need to have this utopia, and we need to understand the necessity of I want to say destructuring, really destroying the organizations of armed people, mostly men, which are the standing armies, the prison guards, jail guards, judges, the whole authority structure, to impose, if you will, or not a friendly word, but to impose our collective will, that we decide what we want, and we are going to persevere, and we're going to carry this out. Perhaps the last thing I'd like to touch on is this idea that small local alternatives are the strategic solution as a utopia. I can't agree with that. I think that's a mistake. I think it takes a truth and makes it into a general goal. For example, would we want to do away with the scientific capacity of having vaccines, of having health medicines, of having all kinds of scientific help, and give us the ability to communicate with people all over the world? Do we want to give up all plastics, all steel, all electricity, and go back to cutting logs and having, you know, local communities built on sustainable farming in their local area? I don't think so. I don't think that would be progressive. Then we'll be going back to the cavemen days. And I think that Marx is right, that the whole question is, how do we transform the infrastructure, get rid of what's bad, and build on what's useful and can be sustainable? Can we have steel production without having overproduction of hundreds of millions of tons of steel in a competitive marketplace? If we had a plan, of course we could. Just like saying, could we get rid of racism by establishing a class rule? Not inherently. It has to be an all-around ideological, transformative process. And that's where I think we need to engage, because the reality is millions of people are and will be thrown up into the air, and that which was firm will turn out to be air, and where that which seemed hopeless will turn out to be hopeful. And I want to stop right there and wait for other people to contribute.
Thanks so much, Earl. Okay, Kaila, if you could use, Clint has told me that you're here on your phone. I think it would be great if you could use that, because I'm worried your internet connection will drop out again, but we'd love to have you in your, feel free to start from the beginning of your remarks.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, and it's much better than last time.
Okay, great. My apologies for that. I'm actually going to connect to several of the topics that Earl just brought up on how it's necessary to connect the current crisis to our economic system and what transforming infrastructure in a sustainable and radical way could look like. So on that topic, I won't go straight from the top because I think that'll be a little unnecessary. So moving into the talking points of the Green New Deal and how it's a bold 10-year plan to mobilize every aspect of American society in the fight against climate change and economic inequality. It achieves 5 goals that I think are very important and crucial in amplifying as to answering these questions and kind of understanding what the politics of environmentalism could and should be. So the first of those goals is that it would achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions and 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030 through a fair and just transition for all former fossil fuel workers. And that transition moves into point number 2, which is that it would create millions of good high-wage jobs, which then moves into point number 3, which is those jobs would invest in the infrastructure and industry to sustainably meet the challenges of the 21st century. And what are those challenges? Moving into number 4, the Green New Deal would secure clean air and water. It would secure climate and community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment. And then last but certainly not least, it would promote justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities. So on the other side of the transition to putting this resolution into action, work would be different. The economy would operate on new principles, and 3 pillars would be exemplified that would be the basis of the foundation of the new society. These would be good jobs for all, a democratic economy, and a good life for all. So I'll try to be brief as I go over those 3 pillars. So beginning with good jobs for all, a core component of the Green New Deal is a policy called the job guarantee. And that's because real climate action creates millions of jobs. If you just think about any city, whether it's urban or rural, there's a mind-boggling amount of work that could potentially be done in the switch to sustainable energies. You would need people to build wind farms, solar installations, smart grids, or charging stations, electric bus lines, and bullet trains. And that's not even going into the food component, which is that you would need people to grow healthy, sustainable food in every community of this country at a local level. This would also include planting billions of trees. So I'll let your imagination create more job opportunities, but those are some of the highlighted career paths in the resolution. And while most work in this vision would admittedly still be in the private sector, what the federal job guarantee does is that it sets a standard for wages and benefits that every employer would have to meet. So this policy would especially lift up those who are exploited and underpaid in today's economy. This would include indigenous communities, people of color, immigrants, the formerly incarcerated, people with disabilities, and many more. So these communities have been through centuries of oppression, exclusion, and environmental injustice. They're the Americans who've done the least to cause global warming, and they're often hit first by climate chaos. So moving on to shifting the economy, this goes to the second pillar, which is a democratic economy. So the Green New Deal would be grounded in local democracy, and I think the best example that's tangible right now of what this would look like is an energy democracy. So that's when communities own and control their own electricity, and wind and solar are especially well suited to this model because they're small-scale decentralized technologies, which they literally put power into the hands of the people, which is kind of a bit poetic. And the federal government would still provide the infrastructure and support to make it easy. So it would be funded from the top, but administered from the bottom. So local municipalities would decide what gets done based off the needs and skills of their communities. And the community focus brings me to my third pillar, or the Green New Deal's third pillar, which is a good life for all. So the Green New Deal also calls for things like ample leisure time and universal access to healthy food and nature, and in doing so, champions a better life for all, which is great. And to connect back to the introductory question, which is regarding how this utopic vision connects back to leftist movements of the past. In all of the 3 areas that I just described, guaranteeing good jobs, economic democracy, and a better life for all, you can learn from very real historical precedents of the 30s and 40s, because a lot of this has actually been done before. The New Deal is fairly idealized today, but it was actually incredibly controversial at its time. And the 1930s saw a wave of mass labor organizing and strikes, and people power was the major force behind the victories of the New Deal. And they succeeded, and they put millions of people to work transforming our infrastructure, conserving the land, and even making public art. So, admittedly, the Green New Deal would be the biggest thing that we've done since FDR's original New Deal, or the remaking of the economy during World War II. But I think what made those 2 historical moments so important is that they were both urgent responses to a fairly harrowing emergency. just like climate change is today. The fact is that climate change is an even greater threat than the Great Depression or World War II because it, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, it threatens the very existence of collective life on this planet. The Green New Deal would improve not only the nature of past movements and policies, but it would simultaneously uphold both environmental and social justice. So to connect back to Sunrise Movement and why we're specifically talking on this panel, when looking at the vision of the Green New Deal and wondering where exactly today's current leftist movement comes into play, there's this researcher named Erica Chenoweth who surveyed hundreds of social movements and campaigns. And what she found was that once a movement activates 3.5% of the population, every single movement succeeded in meeting their demands. So in the United States, 3.5% is 11 million people. That's admittedly quite a few. But we need mass non-cooperation to win this. And it is our role, both at Sunrise and throughout the nation, to grow a movement of increasing scale and disruption that can carry out mass non-compliance with the status quo. In order to win the Green New Deal or a vision like it, we need both an active base of public support and support of public officials to actually push the legislation through. And we're doing this. Sunrise has been building support for the Green New Deal in every corner of the country and right here at our local hub in Chicago. We'll continue to pressure every candidate, elected official, and presidential contender to see where they stand on the Green New Deal. And when major events have been happening nationally and locally, young people are turning out and taking action because these climate events are already here and they're already hurting people. Because ultimately, climate change is far from the only emergency that we're dealing with, and you can't really isolate it from the other major problems of our society and environmental politics. Systemic racism is an urgent crisis. We have an economy and democracy that functions for the few people who live from wealth and not the majority who live from work. Inequality has skyrocketed and crushing poverty remains a reality, and the exploitation of the planet is worsening. These crises are all connected, and the Green New Deal could change this. So I realize I've been talking about labor organizing and social welfare at an environmentalist panel, but I really do think that the two go hand in hand and that we can draw upon our history as we illustrate our future policies, and the Green New Deal exemplifies that quite well. So yeah, that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaila, and thanks everyone. I'm sure if we were in a room, the audience would be clapping. So at this point, we're going to go into responses. And since we had a lot of technical issues, I will ask the panelists to try and kind of keep their responses to each other pretty short. We'll say 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll just let you know when it's time to wrap up. We'll go in the same order that we went in for the opening remarks. While this is happening, audience members, please feel free to submit your questions. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please do not submit your question anonymously. Please submit it with your name, and we will keep a stack, and I will be asking your questions to the panelists after they have their responses. So Christian, do you want to?
Yes, okay, those were all really great comments, presentations. So, I mean, just quickly, you know, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that we are hostage to modernity. So, I mean, this is to some extent in response to Max. In many ways, I share the vision of a simpler, you know, pre-industrial time. But one of the main problems with that is that we are physically hostage to the technological history of modernity, you know, with capitalism at its heart. But, you know, much of these problems were also produced by socialist social relations. So we've got in this country, you know, 50 atomic power stations. We've got 1,600 Superfund sites. You know, we have this infrastructure that needs to be managed by experts and with technology. And so we're locked into features of modernity. And I think that frequently the kind of deep ecology left doesn't grapple with that. And there's much that I agree with in the deep ecology kind of worldview. But I think that you guys should think about that. What do we, if we're serious about this, how do we get from this? Because we can't just walk away from this infrastructure. It'll blow up. I mean, it's not like the collapse of Rome. When Rome collapsed, there was, my good friend Jason Moore is working on a book that deals with this in some detail. When Rome collapsed, you know, the standard of living for what became the European peasantry, many of whom were, you know, serfs and slaves under the Roman Empire, the standard of living went up as measured by their height and, you know, what we can tell archaeologically. That we're not in the same situation because Rome was an organic economy. When it collapsed, its 1% was removed, but they didn't have atomic power plants that would melt down and pollute entire regions for 10,000 years. So that's the hostage to modernity thing. I also think that the deep ecology argument runs the risk of alienating the mass of people. That I know what you're saying is more sophisticated than this, but it is possible to misunderstand the message as, oh, the problem are people. If I'm the problem, you know, the average person is like, oh, I'm the problem. It's like, well, I'm busy enough struggling every day to get to work, make ends meet. So, you know, I don't want to be part of a movement that blames me. And then you could also say, well, if people are the problem, then be the change you want to see and, you know, off yourself. And I think it's just politically a non-starter. And I mean, I know that's not what you're saying, though. You're not, but that it's open to that kind of a misreading. And you know, yes, human beings have been involved in all sorts of extinctions, but so have parts of nature. When big cats 18.5 million years ago came to the Americas, they were responsible for massive extinction events in the Americas. So, and then finally, you know, I'm all for relocalization, but also some of the worst aspects of American history are rooted in the local. Segregation was local, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, I really think we've got to move away from this argument about overpopulation. Overpopulation is not the issue. It's overconsumption and it's unsustainable forms of production. I was told to wrap it up.
Great, thanks, Christian.
Yeah.
Max, your turn.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks everyone for your comments, and thanks Christian. Yeah, I think you make some good points for sure. I think I like that term that we're hostage to modernity, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And, you know, I don't know that there are simple answers to the situation that we're in, and I'm wary of oversimplifying things, and I think many people on all different sides, all different perspectives like to oversimplify things and ignore these complexities and these difficult questions rather than really seriously engaging with them and saying, yeah, that's a real issue. Obviously, we do have this type of nuclear waste. And I think one of the big complications that I see with that is now you have a lot of environmentalists, quote unquote, people like James Hansen, pushing for more nuclear energy to address the climate crisis, which is insane if you ask me. So I agree, we are hostage to modernity.
I totally agree on that. That's idiotic.
Yeah. And from my perspective, I think we need to start with points of unity. I think we should start with the most destructive industries and work backwards from there. I think, you know, these things that we can probably all agree on, like climate justice, like some sort of local control tempered with some sort of broader level understanding about justice and our values as a society to stop what you were talking about segregation and so on at the local level. We need to dismantle the fossil fuel industries. We need to respect indigenous sovereignty, you know, address the most toxic of these industries and work backward from there. And at some point, I think we'll have to deal with all these points where we disagree more immediately in the present, but I don't think we're necessarily there yet. Although obviously, you know, you need to talk about your strategy throughout a campaign, including at the beginning, right? So just to address quickly what you said, Earl, about steel, I would argue that it's not just overproduction, it's production itself that's the problem. Steel and coking coal production is the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's one of the most destructive industries on the planet, bar none. 5 of the 10 largest iron ore mines in the world are in the Amazon rainforest and account for thousands of square miles of deforestation, not to mention the pollution, the poisoned rivers, the destruction of indigenous communities, all sorts of slave labor issues and sexual exploitation issues. And I would argue that recycling isn't a solution for a couple reasons. First, because a lot of steel is already recycled, so we can't get that much better at recycling than we already are. And secondly, because the steel recycling industry itself is incredibly toxic. In many cities, scrap yards where they bring the steel for recycling are the most toxic place in the entire city, right? So I think, I don't think there are easy questions to this, because I hear what you're saying. We have gotten some real benefits as a society and as individuals from this modernity, but I think that we need to question these things and look at them deeply. And I think we need to study them and not just say, let's make steel production work, but I think we need to look at what is this actually made of? How does this look in terms of labor, in terms of the planet, in terms of pollution, and so on?
Thanks, Max. Earl, do you want to respond to the other panelists?
Well, I'll give it a shot, yeah. Let's see. So, Max, I was watching a show last night about the Cuban medical developments and interferon and stuff like that. And I'm wondering, would you be willing to give up modern medical science? Or would you want to see sustainable developments along these lines?
Yeah,
and go ahead, just take 30 seconds of my time, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say quickly, I guess, that, I mean, I am alive today because of modern medicine. I had to take antibiotics about, 3 months ago because I had a tooth infection, right? I would have been dead in a pre-industrial world. As my friend said, I am 1830s dead right now. But, to me, that's a reality. And obviously there's the tragedies of modern medicine. I think we should keep as much of that as we possibly can. And then I think there's the physical realities of what the land can sustain and what it cannot. And I think those are specific questions that depend on what we're talking about. But I think in terms of something like steel, to me, it's obvious that steel production in the modern sense is not sustainable at all. And so sooner or later, we're not going to have it. And, we can talk about, obviously there's a lot of metal laying around in the society. Maybe we can keep using that in some sort of sustainable ways and transform it and reuse it and so on. So that's sort of a short answer, but thank you.
Okay, so I would suggest, I think when we were talking about alternative energy sources away from fossil fuels, I haven't read a lot about it, but what I understand is that solar panels have a lot of processes that deal with a lot of waste, and wind power or even power from the tides all require very complicated industrial-based machinery. If you've seen the turbines, they're like 6 stories high, 30-foot wingspan to the length of. These are metal. These are electric. It's, in other words, I think if it's not about going back to an illusory past where past civilizations have been careful of sustaining nature, the reality is it's nothing pretty like that at all. My girlfriend and I at the time were, now my partner, we went camping in the Four Corners and we saw exhibits there which went through the whole process of the development of their civilization until they disappeared around 1100 AD. They cut down all of the trees within walking distance of their sites because they were growing, they were expanding, they had more surplus, they had larger population, and they cut down all the trees and it caused deforestation and so on. So I think we could learn lessons, millions of wonderful lessons about the need to integrate ourselves into nature, but humans are changers. We change society, and we're not going to go back. I hope we could go back, but if it'll be the destruction of civilization. And I get too emotionally involved, so I get all quivery and quaky. So I'm going to stop, except for one thing. I'll just take 30 seconds this question of the Green New Deal that Taylor, you were raising, right? So I don't understand how we're going to get all these jobs, how we're going to democratize it, and it's still going to be private ownership of the productive places of the workshops in America or any place in the world with this. In other words, are you going to entice or take away their power to control production? You can say we're going to make you pay these wages, but so the assumption is that the state will be neutral and will be in favor of this and will impose this on capital. Is that what you're saying? Because it seems totally unrealistic that we could do that without a revolutionary movement.
Yeah, that's a good question that I think is one of the main points that's being talked over right now. And essentially, it would just be extreme government intervention in the market that would be regulating private equity more. And that's obviously a controversial statement. I think the main talking points are that the benefits of doing so outweigh the current status quo phenomenally. But
For
yeah,
whom?
you're definitely for the groups that I was discussing right now, with there being such large scale inequality and corporate profit, for it to not be regulated, it's a failing system. So here's a plan that's being put forth to deal with that inequity. But I mean, you're absolutely right that it's very controversial and would be radical to say the least. But yeah, it does boil down to just heavy government intervention in the market.
I'll quit. Let other people take time.
Kayla,
Thank
would you
you
like
for
to
the
say
response.
anything else? Would you like to say anything else to respond to the panelists?
That was for Kayla, right? You were asking her?
Yeah, Kayla?
Yes, sorry, this connection is not the best. No, that was my answer. Yeah.
Okay, great. Then I'm going to jump into the Q&A, and we already have a pretty large stack. So I'm going to ask, I'll be doing mostly one question at a time, except when there's like a question for a specific person. Maybe then I'll put two together. So we have a question from Matt Schweitzer. Matt asks, he says, the UN says there can be no peace without sustainable development. And there can be no sustainable development without peace. This is problematic because sustainable development is rooted in neoliberal capitalism and an extractive economy. I'm concerned that our utopias are ideologically constrained by the very infrastructure it seems contingent upon. Only Marx seems to address this. And he says in parentheses, destroy the means of production, don't just seize it. So I'm curious, one, if there are other working models for peace and conflict resolution not based on sustainable development, and two, would a Green New Deal still rely on industry and dirty, unsustainable resource extraction, in which case are we ever truly, can we ever truly consider a utopia outside of the infrastructure that defines our very vision of the future? And then we have a question that's for Earl from Justin G. Justin says, thank you for the global economic overview, Earl. I'm intrigued to hear more about how you see the current economic crisis versus 2008 to 2009, or if you think they can even be considered separately. I'll open that up.
I can answer the Green New Deal question. So in terms of the problems that neoliberal capitalism has wreaked on society, I don't think that you currently, at least in the 10-year plan that the Green New Deal is aiming for, I just don't really see it being possible to fully uproot those problematic systems. However, I think the Green New Deal is the best probable route that we have for the next foreseeable decade, regardless of, you know, what utopic visions would be best. I think it's like pretty inarguably the best step forward, and it's a very progressive plan. But yeah, you bring up good points that we're definitely stuck in a context that
has structural issues that Max addressed well. But yeah, I think if you're looking at a 10-year plan, something along the lines of the Green New Deal is really the most exceptional move forward that you're going to be able to get within the US.
If I could weigh in on that too, well put, Kaila. I mean, I think that, you know, the Green New Deal, maybe for some people that's as far as they want to go, but for a lot of people view it as a kind of, you know, a triage, an emergency intervention, the way Kaila was describing it. And there's a political realism that recommends it, which is that it's a message that is rooted in American history. It sort of indigenizes and familiarizes something that could potentially seem totally alien and dangerous and disruptive by linking it to the history of the New Deal. And it's realistic about meeting the people of this country. You know, other countries have, in different political contexts, have different versions of this to some extent, but we're talking about American politics here. And it's like, it's about realistically meeting Americans where they're at. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of Americans, through no fault of their own, are very confused about all these issues. You could watch television and read the mainstream news all day long, every day of the week, and in most cases, you probably come out dumber on these questions, right? So it's really hard to kind of like unpack these questions. And so I think part of what recommends the Green New Deal is it's about trying to engage people where they're at and bring them forward from there. It doesn't, you don't have to become some sort of sophisticated revolutionary first to get on board with it. And it does that not because that leads to the best outcome, you know, or a perfect society, but because it's realistic, as Kaila was saying earlier, about the very compressed time frame of climate change and trying to bring down emissions and build out a renewable capacity and you know, trying to mitigate and adapt in real time as much as possible. Now, I feel often that there is something unsaid or lurking in the background, and maybe this is my generational thing. You know, like revolution, you know, revolution, a total revolution against capital implies violence, right? I personally have no moral qualms whatsoever about that. However, I have very serious political worries about it. You know, when I was a teenager, I spent time in Central America, in Nicaragua, in my early 20s. I spent time in El Salvador and spent time with the FMLN. Then later, I spent time on and off as a war correspondent for many years. And it's like, I'm acutely aware of how violence can get out of control. And you know, also from those experiences and from reading, it's not like every revolution that devolves into some sort of corrupt, despotic shit show does so because the people in charge just didn't have the right ideas or just didn't have it together. It's actually a lot harder than it looks to do stuff like this. And it was those experiences in the 20th century that created a kind of like social democratic caution in much of particularly the Latin American left, which I feel heavily influenced by because I came up in the Central American Solidarity movement and, you know, spent time down there. So it's important, I think, to separate tactical questions and strategic questions from sort of like ultimate moral judgments on stuff. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, that's something to keep in mind, that part of why, I mean, you know, part of the failures that you saw in Evo Morales' government and you see in Venezuela, I mean, it's not like if all us clever people went down there and were in charge, everything would suddenly be different. Because it's, you know, the enemy has a vote, as they say in the military, right? Capital strikes back and messes with you. And part of what the Green New Deal does is it tries to avoid stepping onto the terrain where capital and the worst parts of the capitalist state have the upper hand. Which is like, if you want to get violent, they're like, we've got that. We have a global surveillance infrastructure. We've got a military that's larger than the next 14 largest. We have a gigantic prison system. We have totally militarized police forces. If you want to play Che Guevara, please be our guest, because we will, you know, mop the floor with you. And so the trick is to create mass movements that pressure that can contain and control and impose our will on capital without triggering that moment of illegality and crisis and violence in which capital will take off the gloves and, recent history indicates have the upper hand. So I put that out there simply because it's like, it doesn't come up that much. Sometimes I feel like the vision or the hope of like a kind of a revolutionary horizon that to my mind could only be arrived at quickly through some sort of real violent confrontation gets invoked. Not that anyone on this panel was doing that necessarily, without any discussion about, well, what does that take and what are the risks involved, and what has the global left in its attempts to do that over the last 100 years learned, and what adaptations has it developed, what are the flaws in those adaptations, where does that leave us now?
I can jump in and add a quick response here. First, I just want to say this is an awesome discussion. I really appreciate what you all are saying and appreciate the space to have this conversation, because this doesn't happen very often. And I think these are the most important topics, obviously, in the world, I think. So, on this idea of sustainable development, I'm going to jump back in a second to what you were just saying, Christian. I think one important point to make is that only a small portion of energy use today goes to food, housing, basic medical care, like the necessities of life for people, right? The vast majority of energy use, of consumption, of production goes to luxuries. It goes to data centers, to industry, to the rich, the ruling class, right? So part of the question with the whole Green New Deal and the push for green energy, to me, is what is the power going to? Where is that energy going to go to? If we are just going to replace fossil fuels as we are in this sort of peak oil climate change situation, if we're just going to replace fossil fuels with another power source without fundamentally changing consumption patterns and changing the economy of the society, that to me does not seem like a solution. And that seems like the main danger with the Green New Deal situation to me, is that, I think, Shell Oil Company, General Electric, some of the largest corporations in the world are 100% bought into the green energy thing. They're investing heavily in it. I mean, Ford is putting solar panels on their factories, and, Walmart, Apple, Google, these are, multi-billion-dollar companies that are obviously not helping the average person. They're not helping the state of the world. They don't have our best interests at heart, and they're all doubling down on this green energy stuff. And for me, that says it doesn't fundamentally threaten the status quo of capitalism. It doesn't threaten accumulation. It doesn't threaten the exploitation of workers. It doesn't threaten the destruction of the planet, even, in my sense. Because again, if you're just producing power to power this consumeristic economy and this sort of endless cycle of capitalist accumulation, then it doesn't really matter what the power source is coming from. You're still just fueling a death machine, right? So I think to some extent we all need to become engineers in addition to all becoming ecologists. And I think we need to really interrogate and study these things in detail, because it's easy to talk about, wind, solar, these things are sustainable. And, I used to be a big advocate of wind and solar and these type of things. And I'm not anymore. In fact, I wrote a book that's coming out early next year called Bright Green Lies, that's sort of dismantling in detail a lot of these green technologies and why exactly they are harmful, and sort of laying it out, not just theoretically, but like, let's look at this specific iron ore mine. Let's look at this copper mine. Let's look at a wind turbine design and who made it, who's exploited in the process of making it, where it's being installed, who lives there, what kind of wild beings live there, who's displaced, and so on. I think it's important that we not take for granted what we're told by a government, by a corporation, by a nonprofit, by any of us on this panel. I think people need to interrogate these things themselves, right? And the final point that I want to make here is that I think if there ever was a time to be completely honest about what we need, it's now. And I say this very much respecting what you're saying, Christian, about, this democratic socialist caution, because that phrase makes a lot of sense. And I've studied some of that history. I'm sure you know it better than me, but I feel you and I hear what you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense. And I also feel like we're in this situation where the world is going to be changing extremely fast. You know, if we look at the world today compared to 3 weeks ago, you know, all of a sudden we have Republicans arguing for UBI. You know, that was literally unthinkable 3 weeks ago. So I think that we're seeing these huge jumps in the political situation, and with the acceleration of climate chaos, I think what was once sort of a cutting edge thing like the Green New Deal is going to seem like, why did we even think that that was cutting edge in the future? That's my perspective. I don't know that I'll be right. Obviously, I'm kind of trying to predict the future here. So there's uncertainty, obviously. And you know, one of the quotes that's been coming to my mind with all this Corona stuff is James Connolly, you know, famous Irish socialist revolutionary, who said in 1909, he said, "Revolution is never practical until the hour of the revolution strikes. Then it alone is practical. And all the efforts of the conservatives and the compromisers become the most futile and visionary of human imaginings." And I think that we are in a situation that is so serious that we need to really have everything on the table. And I mean, that's why I love this discussion, as I was saying. You know, I was lucky enough in 2010 to go to the Arctic with a group of climate scientists and spend time in northern Russia above the Arctic Circle and walk on thawing permafrost and see these entire forests falling over as the permafrost was thawing underneath them, and see this whole entire sort of crumbling Cold War era small city, you know, beginning to tilt and fall over as the foundations became unstable. So, you know, I feel like our minds and our political realities within this bubble of human society have not caught up to the ecological reality of what's happening and how fast the change is happening and how fast it's coming. And I think that in coming decades, we're all going to be grappling with that and sort of rushing to catch up with the reality of the situation. So thank you.
Okay, I have another question. And so this question is coming from Danny Jacobs. And then there are two very closely related questions that may have even been responses. I think some people saw the question he posted. And so I'm going to kind of pose them together. So Danny Jacobs writes, "It's sometimes difficult to understand why environmental justice should be part of a socialist program. When Marx made his comments about the metabolic rift, they were with respect to the new dynamic bourgeois society versus the traditional medieval order. It was not about damage to the soil or other kinds of environmental damage, but about the transformation of humanity. All that's solid melts into the air," as he says in the manifesto. In other words, that metabolic rift was not something that could be patched together, and it is unclear if one wants to. Environmental justice, whether it intends to or not, seems to only mean at least patching this back together. And in response to this question, Sunit Singh wrote, so it's the question, might not calls for environmental justice and socialism actually be opposed to one another? Could they be, you know, not the same thing? Or what's the difference between the two? And then related to this, Richard Rubin asks, because the Green New Deal has come up, I think it's really related to this question of whether socialism and environmental politics are the same thing. What is it that makes the Green New Deal not just capitalist politics? Because the New Deal was capitalist politics, so what about this Green New Deal? So I'd like to pose that first question about, is our calls for environmental justice opposed to socialism potentially, and then the Green New Deal?
Particularly of me?
Yeah, go ahead, Earl.
Okay, so the question was, what, if I recall through our discussions, the question was, how do I see the economic crisis that I just talked about a little bit developing? But I'd like to say it's really interesting to me, Max. I happen to agree with you 100%, even though I don't on the strategy or the goals exactly, about what you read with Connolly and Revolution. If capitalism is the root of the exploitation of nature, which puts accumulation of wealth and value as the top priority, and capitalism has to go because nature has to be, we have to live within nature and not destroy it, which calls for the end of the capitalist system. So the question that was asked was, how do I see this developing? In fact, I think we're living in crazy time, if you will. Why? Because hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars have been given to capitalists starting with 2008, 2009 in vast quantities that were never seen before. And yet it did not lead to a huge investment cycle. And in fact, it was consumption and consolidation of wealth. So now the hundreds of billions of dollars that were given are now diminished or in size because they are giving trillions. The deal that Congress just passed and that Trump signed calls for $2 trillion, $500 billion, which will go to industry and corporations with very few, some strings, but not much. And from what I've read, there's room for another $4 trillion to be developed on top of that. And governments all over the world and their central banks are printing money like crazy. And yet it's not going to solve the problems of the system. So we are going to see more upheaval, more shortages, more hardships, more imposition of power. And that goes into this topsy-turvy world because the continuing destruction of the environment is not going to be tipped. From what I understand of the Green New Deal that Bernie and AOC backed, it doesn't call for any forced changes in production. It offers opportunities for jobs, and it offers opportunities for green energy, so-called. But it doesn't take over power over productive resources away from capital. And so I think we're going to be seeing, maybe not me, I won't be around that long, but we will be seeing upheavals like we couldn't even imagine, just like you were saying, Max, 3 weeks ago. What we're seeing now is unbelievable. Well, the idea that we're going to have some social democratic reform over the next 10 years or so, for the reasons that Christian gave, they're important questions. But revolutions are not made because some revolutionaries decide to have revolution. I'm arguing a traditional point, if you will, that if we want to deal with the climate, we want to deal with the hardships that are coming, it's necessary to have a political organization that's clear that when masses of people can no longer accept things as they are, that they're ready to play a role, as Marx or Lenin put it, as a midwife to a bloody process. Revolution. The Bolsheviks didn't create the Russian Revolution that overthrew the Tsar. Lenin didn't even believe it when he was told it. Said, no, this can't be true. Revolutionary movements develop out of conditions and change in consciousness in which revolutionaries can contribute, but are not the cause. And the argument that violence will be used, when the sailors on board the Theodore Roosevelt nuclear-powered aircraft carrier currently anchored at Guam are now getting the virus. The captain wrote a 4-page letter to the Navy asking for them to be able to take everybody off the ship and quarantine them in isolated properties. The Navy commanders refused to do that and have ordered the ship to continue even though the virus is on board and spreading, and they're in close proximity and they can't quarantine. How do you think that's going to sit with the sailors and the others in the military when they see the commanders basically saying, fuck you people, go ahead and die, we want these missions completed? In other words, there are dynamics at work that unsettle what looks like a united front of power, and the power of the working class extends into the military formations. And I'll leave it at that.
If
That was
others
my
don't want to
response.
hop in, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
no, Kaila, go ahead.
Yeah, my point's not too long. It doesn't relate as much to the former point, but the original question and how the Green New Deal is maybe environmentalism and socialism are incompatible, and how the person posing the question is reconciling those points. I don't entirely remember what it was, but I'll look at as my screen went away again. But I think the key thing to remember in this discussion is that I absolutely agree with the fact that the baseline is that if you don't change consumption patterns and kind of the root basis of where these issues are stemming from, you're not truly going to solve any of the issues that we're talking about. However, I just want to really push the point that there's an urgent crisis with climate change that's happening, and there is a 10-year deadline, essentially. So I think the point of the Green New Deal is that it is the biggest step listed towards combining environmentalism and socialism, because the exploitation of people and the planet are two key pillars in a culture that allows billionaires and corporations to amass more and more wealth. And I think they're just immensely intertwined. And I actually want to push back on the point that after this virus is over, the Green New Deal would be widely accepted, because as much as I hate to see it, Trump's approval ratings are actually going up right now. I don't foresee us coming out of this with the Green New Deal being the baseline for public approval ratings. And I think maybe, you know, after something like this gets passed, you can continue to push back, because these are really important questions that are being asked today on, okay, you promote something like this and then it gets put forward. Is it just capitalism with a green spin? And maybe it is, but you've at least halted part of the step towards environmental catastrophe, and you can work from there. But I think there's just steps along the way, and you kind of have to work with what you have, and this is kind of the nearest vision towards achieving that vision. But I mean, definitely push back on me if you have another thought on that. I'd love to hear it.
Well, I'm not going to push back on you, Kaila, but I'm going to follow up with something. I mean, the question about the metabolic rift and is socialism and you know, sustainability, are they even compatible? I mean, I think sustainability is its own thing. Max kind of sketched that out for us in terms of like these pre-capitalist histories that involved, you know, deforestation and basically types of extinction events. So it's not as simple as, oh, capitalism is the only problem and that you get rid of capitalism and everything automatically becomes sustainable. No, history does not show us that. But definitely the metabolic rift was very much about sustainability. I mean, that term, Marx actually says, you know, there's a rift in the metabolism of nature, and it's John Bellamy Foster who then calls it the metabolic rift. And it's in a letter to Engels where Marx is talking about reading the Ricardo on differential ground rent and how bad Ricardo is on this, and like why does some pieces of agricultural land command higher prices than others? And Marx says, well, I've had to go to German soil chemistry. I'm reading Justus von Liebig. You know, he's much better than Ricardo, and Justus von Liebig was the scientist who cracked the chemistry of soil. People had been for thousands of years without understanding the chemistry, you know, adding nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NKP, what plants need, or, you know, what plants crave, for those of you who've seen Idiocracy. So it was very much about the soil and the environment. And Marx and Engels Engels in particular comments explicitly about how ridiculous it is that people flush their waste down into the Thames, and how this is leading to soil depletion. So there's a way in which the metabolic rift is really, really simple. It's just about how the cycle of nutrients gets disrupted through the social relations of capitalism. You have production in one place, consumption in one place, and a different place, and then that alone, even an organic economy, can break this otherwise closed loop of, you know, things come out of the soil, they die, they go back into the soil. And you know, the Green New Deal, in its defense, is, unless I've missed something, is mostly a set of goals. It's not really a set of means. I mean, I don't think it's really been fleshed out about how much public ownership there should or shouldn't be. And in terms of the whole question of the line between capitalism and something else, I think it's I think that's not a good way to think about it, because this is the main argument that Karl Polanyi makes in The Great Transformation. And he was, he was a socialist and not a Marxist, I guess is the way you would frame it. And he's not the end all be all, but he's got some important things to say. And one of the key insights from Polanyi in his largely unreadable book, not entirely unreadable, but there's a lot of good history in it, The Great Transformation, is that capitalism is always dependent on pre-capitalist, non-capitalist social relations, the state in particular, but also just, pre-capitalist, non-capitalist forms of community, unpaid work. And part of what he was arguing about the laissez-faire, the idea of a free market society being a dangerous utopia, had to do with this realization that capitalism was essentially a parasitic social form that had attached itself to society and fed off of it. And it produced capitalism produced a fantasy about itself, which was one, that it was totalizing and could be totalizing, and that everything could be ruled not through custom and superstition and solidarity and all these old things, but through prices, right? And he's saying that is totally insane. And that the pattern you see again and again is that the proponents of laissez-faire ideology gain political victories, they get their way, and that itself causes crisis. And there's an economic collapse, there's rebellion, and they go running to the state and they have to be bailed out. And so his line is that laissez-faire is planned and planning is spontaneous. And we're in one of those moments, right? Where this is the result of this long planning of like pushing for deregulation, insisting that laissez-faire is natural. And if it's so natural, why are they constantly shoving it down our throats? And then lo and behold, it blows up. This virus comes along, which should be pretty easy to handle if we had enough, masks and some basic public health infrastructure. But no, neoliberal ideology, the tropes of efficiency have pressed all of that kind of spare capacity that public healthcare systems are and public health is dependent on, pressed it out. And so we have this huge crisis. And as a result, spontaneous planning, right? Spontaneous socialization. And socialization, not necessarily with the progressive redistributive elements, but what Earl's been talking about in particular, right? I mean, we're witnessing a whole-scale socialization of finance that does not call itself that and does not permit any other class than the 1%, the ruling class, to benefit from it. But what's going on here is that the capitalist class was unable to manage the financial system, and it needs the public purse and it needs the state's printing press to prevent total calamity. So getting back to this idea about that there's always an outside of capitalism, I think this is important for a kind of radical, perhaps even revolutionary style of reformist politics. That part of what we have to do is there's constantly this back and forth. How much of nature, how much of life, everyday life in society, human relations will be governed by capital and market mechanisms, money and prices? And how much can we push that back by decommodifying things and making things free, right? Hey, the Republicans are onto something with this free stuff. That is what we want. We want free stuff. We want to remove the middlemen who profit from us, like Zoom here. Anyway, so I think that can maybe be, that's maybe a little abstract, a little meta, but that can hopefully be helpful in terms of thinking about the radical potential of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is as yet unfixed, unbaked. It's in play. I mean, it's a set of goals, the means by which we would achieve, X number of new green jobs and reduced carbon emissions. I mean, that's open. That's what the whole struggle is about. And that there are potentially quite radical infringements upon the rights of capital that come with even this reformist goal. You got to remember, the capitalists hate every single dollar in taxes they have to pay. Every single regulation that they have to submit to hurts them. They hate it. They spend lavishly in creating intellectuals and a whole bevy of think tanks and television stations to argue constantly against this. They are constantly pushing against what we think of as just this minimal constraints upon them. So it's not as simple as, you know, there's capitalism or there isn't capitalism. It's like there's the capitalist system we live in is already heavily dependent on essentially hidden forms of socialism. And that's actually what my forthcoming book, Radical Hamilton, which will be out in the late summer, argues essentially, is that, like, you know, at the heart of this whole project is a very kind of, you know, not egalitarian, not progressive, but a very kind of, technically speaking, socialistic project of planning and subsidy. This whole thing was planned, and it always is, right? And so then the question becomes, well, how are we going to plan it? Well, what are we going to do that? And I mean, there's already, leaving aside new emergency measures, even before the coronavirus, I mean, the level of subsidy that capitalism, American capitalism, is dependent on is mind-boggling, and it's often hidden. You have to, like, dig it out. I was just an article forthcoming about the vast amounts of money that the state spends on rebuilding. Essentially, the entire coastal economies of the United States are entirely dependent on vast sums of welfare for the private sector, right? So at one level, we already have socialism, right? So we don't have to debate, like, you know, would the Green Deal be socialist? How socialist would it be? I mean, we do have to debate those things and kind of shape them, but it's like, let's also start from start with an understanding of just how thoroughly socialized this class society already is, but without any of the social justice that goes with the, you know, the public ownership, the hidden public ownership and subsidies.
Okay, so I want to ask a question from Maria Kaminska, and then a related question from David Fays. So Maria asks, I feel like there could be a kind of disconnect between the ideological, one could say utopian propositions, for example, how overcoming sustainability of industry, somehow overcoming unsustainability of industry without relapsing to pre-modernity, implementing non-Western modes of life in the West, solving the climate crisis through addressing race or gender inequality, etc., and the quite limited pragmatic approach of solving the problem within capitalism. So the Green New Deal, addressing private companies, state-imposed limitations on industry, etc. Can this gap be bridged, and if so, how? And I think this is related to kind of what Christian was talking about. And then I have a question from David Fays. David asks, Sunrise has been involved in the DSA's Democratized ComEd campaign in Chicago. One of the issues raised by participants in the campaign regards how to hold elected positions in the proposed energy board accountable, considering that some examples of municipalized energy have led to cutting corners and keeping fossil fuels to keep costs down because of limited city funds. In any case, I thought that this reflected how the proposals for a Green New Deal and the democratic participation in it through democratized energy were demands that could be possible within the bounds of capitalism. Not to mention how the US is not producing the most carbon emissions at this point as compared to China or India, for example. So these changes, even if they were put into place by the US, would not have as big an impact as suggested. What role does the left play in leadership internationally, but also nationally beyond such demands for capitalist reforms?
I can sort of take a stab at this one. These are pretty dense questions, so I apologize if I'm not going to get to every aspect of the question here because it's quite a lot. But this is, the first part of that question was sort of related to the discussion that was already happening, so I'll try and weave that in here. So I want to say, I don't think that socialism and environmentalism are incompatible at all. If by socialism we just mean, I mean, obviously socialism doesn't necessarily mean an industrial project. That's one, you know, the idea of socialism goes back prior to Marx, it goes back deep into history, right? So I'm actually supportive of reform efforts. I'm supportive of all kinds of efforts. I'm supportive of electoralism, working to change the laws, build political parties. I think all these things are really important, and I think they're stepping stones on the way to social change. I don't think, sort of as Christian was saying about capitalism, I don't think we're sort of in an all or nothing situation where we're either in this state or we're in this state, right? There's gradations here, there's complexities. And I think that, as Earl was saying earlier, I think revolution is sort of wrapped up in this larger process of political change. You know, if you go back to Lenin, I'm not a Leninist particularly, but I think he was pretty brilliant in some ways. And, you know, he obviously talked about how revolution is something that happens. It's not necessarily something that revolutionaries plan and then carry out. Revolution is a break that occurs in society because of these large historical societal forces that play themselves out, and then you get to this point of fracture, right? And that's a point that we are heading towards. So in terms of the question of this sort of ideological disconnect between, you know, the more fundamental change, as Maria was asking in the question, and the sort of Green New Deal reformist change in the immediate present, I think that they're on a spectrum and they're on a continuum, and I think that ultimately they can't be separated from each other. And, you know, I think I'm individually an example of that, in that when I first became interested in environmental issues when I was a teenager, you know, I was signing petitions and writing a letter about save the rainforest, and, you know, I thought that solar panels were going to save the entire world. And obviously my position has changed. But my point is that there was an on-ramp and there was a direct process from that early environmental politicization to the point where I'm at now. And obviously my politics will continue to evolve over time. I think everyone's do, right? So I think it's part of that process. And Erin, would you mind asking the second question again there?
Yeah, so the second question is about the question of leadership. So how should the left lead internationally, especially in a situation where the vast majority of fossil fuel pollution isn't even coming from the United States? So what's the task of the left to lead nationally and internationally? Yeah. There's also a bit of an anecdote about Sunrise Chicago in that, and how, you know, even though they did get some reforms, actually, you know, fossil fuels weren't phased out of some of the things.
Yeah, and I mean, for my part, I think it's a great question, and I think that, you know, I mentioned the term pollution outsourcing earlier, and I think that when we look at global carbon emissions, we really have to look at global carbon emissions, because so many of the products that are consumed in the US come from the Far East. And so as we have seen the lowering of carbon emissions in the West and in Europe and in these places, they have risen concurrently at the same time in the countries that are actually doing the dirty production of the consumer goods and everything, right? So this is a pollution outsourcing process, no different from any sort of externalizing of costs that we see under capitalism, right? So I don't think that we can necessarily say that China has the highest emissions because China has been the world factory for, you know, the last decades, right? So all of the emissions that are being produced in China, some of them are sort of indigenous to that region and their local consumption. Obviously, they have their own issues, and they're an environmentally destructive society like most of the other societies in the world. But I think we need to make clear that that linkage is important. And I think that in terms of the leadership on these issues, I think that, to me, that's why it's incredibly important that we do work in the heart of empire, you know. And my experience has been that, like I said in the beginning of this conversation, I was just in the Philippines working with some people there and doing some organizing there. And the Philippines ostensibly got independence after World War II from, you know, 50 years of US occupation, and before that, several hundred years of Spanish occupation. But the Philippines is a neo-colony, right? It's economically colonized in the world today. So I think that those of us who are working and organizing in the wealthy nations, in the imperial core, need to recognize that probably the best way for us to support our comrades and people in struggle, people suffering in the poor nations and in the colonies, is to dismantle the empire here as fast as we possibly can.
Kaila, I was just wondering if you wanted to say anything, since the Sunrise Movement was brought up in that question about what the role of leftist leadership is.
Sure, yeah, this will be straying a little bit from what Max was saying, but so unfortunately that town hall with Democratize ComEd happened last Saturday, and I was not the person there, so I don't know if I'm the best Sunrise representative to speak to this issue, but I, again, think that the main purpose of what is going on there is that it's pushing forward that second pillar of grounding local democracy and having communities control their own electricity in a sustainable system. And I was not aware actually that fossil fuels hadn't been taken out of the equation at the most recent town hall, but I'm happy to speak to the person who posed that question and put them into contact with my colleague, and we can talk about that more. But yeah, I think at this point in time, it's just a step-by-step process of working with the status quo to push forward that vision.
And then Earl, I saw you unmuted. Were you trying to say something?
I'm just curious how much time we have left.
Yeah, I want to wrap it up actually. So, you know, this is like kind of our end time since we started a bit late. I'll pose one last question and let you guys use that to give closing remarks. So Rebecca Paredes Larson asks, and this was in response to Max's presentation, but I think it actually is a good wider question. So she says, as I understand Marx's theoretical contribution to the left was that socialism is made possible through the contradictions of capitalism. His radical point is not that we should return to pre-modern societal structures, but that capitalism makes the possibility for a completely new kind of society. Why then hold on to Marx at all if the goal is to undo capitalism, especially as Max said, if his philosophy is rooted in Enlightenment, Eurocentric theoretical traditions? Why on earth do we need Marx? And then maybe one more question to chew on. Why on earth do we need socialist revolution? As in, throughout the conversation, people have been talking about the necessity of socialism on the one hand, but the fact that the lack of time to address the environment and the kind of impossibility of revolution means that really what you need to do is pressure the capitalist class to save us before we die. So why do we need Marx to talk about the environment? Why do we need socialism to talk about the environment? And with that, I would ask each panelist to kind of use this to get your last thoughts out there, and then we'll end the discussion.
Who wants to go first? Should I go first or someone else want to go? All right, I'll go.
Christian, why don't you go?
Okay, so, I mean, why
Marx? Because Marx, I would argue, and I think other people on the panel would agree, came up with the best critique of capitalism. And if you don't understand how the system works, you're liable to misunderstand what has to change. So, you know, if you just think that maybe the problem is bad people in charge, we need different people, right? I mean, a non-Marxist analysis that's rooted in like a theory of personality and morality and ethics could lead you there. I mean, that's very often, I mean, that's what political Islam, that's like the limits of political Islam, right? It's like that the people in charge of society aren't moral, and they're not really believing in God. And so we need to replace them, and then the leaders will have different ideas and everything will change. Well, that's just objectively, regardless of what you think about political Islam, that's just in its own terms wrong. That's not what happens. It doesn't work. And so what Marx has done is give us a really deep and detailed critique of how capitalism works. And the core problem is that for capitalists and for capital as a social process of turning use values, utility, usefulness into exchange value, money, which is like a kind of cancer that sort of spreads with the spread of money through society. For the capitalist class that benefits from that process and extracts the profits, the surplus value, ecological suicide, terrible oppression of the masses of people, all of this stuff is totally rational. It's not a mistake. It's not a failure. It's not a shortcoming. It's efficient. It's how things are supposed to work. It's, you know, it's good. And so, I mean, Marx gives us insights into that. I mean, I don't think you should, you know, begin and end with Marx, but it's like, check out Marx. There are few thinkers that are really as useful in terms of thinking about capitalism. And he did not say, I mean, you know, he said many things and he went through various changes, but he did not say that everything has to be wiped away. And that was implied, you know, when he's younger, there's a kind of teleological sensibility in there. But one of the last things he wrote was an answer to a Russian revolutionary, Vera Zesulich, who writes him a letter saying, in Russia, we have communal village structures. And we're wondering here as Russian revolutionaries, you know, does everything have to be obliterated and replaced? Or aren't there old pre-capitalist social forms that in their socialistic, solidaristic, communitarian nature, couldn't they in fact be the basis for a wider form of modern communism? Must all the old things, you know, be washed away? And he's sick, slow to answer her letter. He writes like 5 different drafts, and he finally answers her. He says, no, you're right. You know, so it's the definitive answer from Marx on his deathbed. Essentially, they're like, no, my theory is not this rigid teleological trajectory from primitive communism through XYZ and capitalism into socialism and communism. That actually, you know, part of what the struggle for socialism and communism actually should involve is the conservation and preservation of old socialistic communal forms and their delivery and renovation and expansion into as the basis of modern socialism. And so those would be my comment. And the one last thing, I think, in terms of left leadership, I think one of the most important things that the American left can do, it would be nice if the world were not this way, but the global political economy of capitalism is that there are core economies and peripheral economies. The peripheral economies have been actively underdeveloped for up to 500 years. And as a result, the whole process of technological change and transmission is unequal. And you know, under these conditions, it's not realistic to think that if there was a socialist or, you know, some sort of green radical revolution in a small country like El Salvador, that they would have the wherewithal, the capacity in that economy after 500 years of colonialism and capitalism to develop all the technologies that they would need for kind of sustainable modernity. So the sad fact is that technologies tend to move from core economies out. And so if we can force technological transformation in this economy, that will inevitably have positive reverberations throughout the world and in a very basic way assist people who are trying to create just and sustainable societies in the global south. So and just say that I really appreciated all the questions. I thought they're very sophisticated and everyone's comments. This was a great panel. So Platypus, keep up the great work. Thank you for including me in it.
Thanks, Christian. Who wants to go next? Maybe Earl? Yeah.
I'll go unless somebody else is waiting. I'll go. Okay, so the question was, why Marx and why socialism? Is that right? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's correct. Those are the questions.
So why Marx? So I agree with what Max said, what Christian said, but up to a point. I don't think Marx was primarily about critiquing capitalism. The way I read Marx is that capitalism is based on the exploitation of labor in a particular form through the wage system as opposed to feudalism or slavery, which exploited labor in different ways. And that the product of capitalism that makes it all worthwhile is that it cannot live without a working class to exploit. And because workers everywhere are exploited in the very nature of the capitalist process, not because they're treated badly, but because our labor produces more value than we get back, and therefore its power is in the hand of the class that controls the workplaces. That is a revolutionary potential to unleash the kind of cooperative, collective, democratic dynamic in which the vast majority of people who do the work and will have to see the need to join hands for a collective future, which means no more minority rule. Now, So to me, the central issue around Marx is his analysis that the working class necessarily is the only possible social class that can transform the world and end capitalism. So I think, of course, that Marx is right about that. And the key role for revolutionaries now and going forward is to recognize the impending catastrophe that's falling upon us. And I would urge you to read, Lenin wrote a little pamphlet called The Impending Catastrophe, in which he analyzes the situation he's in. We need to be able to analyze and explain and make those connections and participate in the struggles to the point of preparing for what Marx called the rule of the working class, the first time in history that the majority will actually have power and rule. And this is different than the conception of socialism, where socialism is, we have capitalism for the working class and socialism for the rich. Socialism is not government programs that assist one group or another. At least Marxist socialism isn't. There are lots of socialisms. Marxist socialism, which I think is the most useful and most accurate, is that it's a new class taking power in society, deciding the direction, the kind of morality, the kind of values, the kind of human treatment, the kind of solidarity made practical because the majority are actually participating in power. And that requires working class leadership and a revolutionary party. And that requires the ability to integrate the unfolding catastrophe that is climate change. And these, just because the government is printing trillions of dollars and giving it away to them with some little bit to the rest of us, is not socialism. And I think these are starting points that really this discussion hopefully will be helpful for others. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fair enough. I would just say, but it's also not the free market, right? And a lot of people.
Absolutely. Oh, no.
This is a market society, and it's like, not really, not that much.
I agree with you very much on that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, it's a plan. People make plans all the time. You cannot have a family gathering without somebody making a plan, or the key brother and sister, or the matriarch, or whoever. There's always a plan. And then there's also a question of who's going to carry it out. And is this a plan that I want to be part of? So the key thing about the working class, and you could see it, did anybody see the articles about the workers in Lynn, Massachusetts at the UE plant? They were picketing outside after they had layoffs because of the crisis, and they said, put us to work making, what do they call, ventilators. So they were calling upon the management, the government, and the public to support making socially useful products, not products for profit. And that is a way it's very organic. It rises out of the system. It's not a matter of somebody trying to sell somebody on something.
Thanks so much, Earl. Max or Kaila? Let's go with Max.
I can go ahead, thanks. Thank you both, Christian and Earl, for those comments. I think I agree with a lot of what was said there. I don't think that we need to lionize Marx. I think he was incredibly smart. Obviously, he had a lot of amazing insights, but there have obviously been dozens and hundreds of other incredible thinkers who have other elements of the puzzle, right? So I think Marx had this very important foundational analysis of capitalism, as Earl said, of the exploitation of labor and how that changed over time. And I think one fascinating thing to me that we have seen in Marxism is that it has evolved over time, and it has this built-in process of dialectic that is self-correcting and self-interrogating and self-critiquing. And so we've seen all these different strains of revolutionary thought and different strains of Marxism playing themselves out, testing themselves in the real world of struggle, seeing if they can successfully change the world, right? And I think my foundational point isn't that we need to throw away Marx, it's that we need to build on that foundation, on the foundation of many other thinkers and analysts and strategists and fighters throughout history, based on the new situation that we find ourselves in. And, you know, I'm reminded in this conversation of Oscar Wilde in 1891, wrote a book called The Souls of Man Under Socialism. Of course, it was just man, 1891. And he wrote, "The fact is that civilization requires slaves. The Greeks were quite right there. Unless there are slaves to do the ugly, horrible, uninteresting work, culture and contemplation become almost impossible." I would completely disagree with that if you look at the amount of leisure time that non-industrialized peoples have compared to our 40-hour work weeks. But he goes on, "Human slavery is wrong, insecure, and demoralizing." Obviously, we all agree with that. "On mechanical slavery, on the slavery of the machine, the future of the world depends." So he's basically making an argument in 1891 for the sort of luxury communism that people are advocating now, right? The AI-powered robotic communism where none of us have to work and everything gets delivered to us. It's a massive problem because I think...
Max, you're breaking up. Right when we were getting to the end too. Okay. Well, other people, Christian, you can't hear him either, right? It's not just me. Yeah. Okay, Kaila, why don't you maybe give your closing remarks, and if Max comes back, we can let him speak as well.
Sure. I'll keep it fairly brief. Yeah, as a closing remark, thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed this conversation. I think everyone has brought up really great points that I'm going to be thinking about for the remainder of the evening. But on the note of why do we need socialism in environmentalism, I won't speak as much to the Marx component of this discussion because that's not so much the vision of Sunrise. So as their representative, I don't want to put my own personal views forward on that, but I think he does continue to inform very valid critiques of capitalism and exploitation, but more so to the immediate form of environmentalism. I think that it ensures a communal orientation that's essential. So, for example, as you transition workers out of the fossil fuel industry, hopefully in the coming decade, it's key that there is a fair and just transition that recognizes the historical oppression from capitalist systems that has been ongoing for frontline and vulnerable communities, as well as workers who are losing their jobs. If you're, say, a coal miner and you just needed a job and obviously aren't trying to profit off of environmental degradation on a global scale. So I think in terms of making sure that there are equitable and just transitions as the energy sector shifts into the renewable form, it's key to uphold those values of socialism in communal focus and communal equity. So that's all I'll say on that. So yeah, thank you for having me.
No problem. Thanks for coming, Kaila. All right, Max, is there one last thing you want to say? I want to wrap this up, but unfortunately the internet cut out mid-sentence, right? It sounded like you're going to say something really important to you, so.
Yeah, sorry about that. So just to finish up briefly, I just have a few quick points here. I don't think that the environmental crisis has made eco-socialism or some sort of ecological revolution inevitable. I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. You know, Rosa Luxemburg wrote about socialism or barbarism, right? And I think we're headed deeper into this sort of dystopian society. And it's not inevitable. People are fighting back, right? We're organizing, working together, but there are really big forces that we're fighting, and not just the ruling class and the capitalists, but, you know, natural processes that have been set in motion by centuries of exploitation of the natural world, right? So the question for me is, can we build serious movements fast enough to meaningfully change the course of things? And I think those movements have to be based in serious analysis, serious thought, intellectual engagement with all these ideas. And I think they really need to be based in love and in a deep humanity. You know, I love the natural world. I love people. I love human beings, my family, my friends, my community. You know, other people like like you all on this call who I've just met, but you know, through this discussion, I start to get a little sense of who you are as a human being and the values that you hold and the things that are dear to you and the moral questions that you're asking yourself and struggling with and grappling with, like we all are, you know. And I think it's really important that our movements be intellectual, but also not be so intellectual that we lose track of that sort of foundational humanity and the foundational reasons that we're doing these things. So with that said, that's pretty much all I got. I just want to thank you all for having me and thank all the other panelists. Some fantastic questions. Thanks to Platypus and thanks to Aaron for facilitating this conversation.
Thanks, Mac. Thank you, everyone. Audience members, you can find in the chat links to the other events that we'll be having. We're having a panel on the American Revolution tomorrow evening. On Saturday afternoon, we're having a panel about Bonapartism in the state. And Saturday evening, we're having a panel on socialism in the 21st century. And so the link to the full schedule can be found in the chat. Also in the chat is a link to a Zoom where we will be hosting a discussion afterwards for anybody who wants to come and just talk. If it ends up that all like 85 of you, all 91, I guess, participants, if all 91 of you come, we can make smaller rooms so that people can have discussions. So please come along and thank you, everyone. Bye.